Greetings, podcast listeners, and welcome back to a new episode of Britain in 1919 to 1939. In this episode, we will be looking at how the British prepared for the Second World War. After a relatively peaceful 1920s, the prospect of a Second World War began to show itself in the 1930s. With conflict sprouting from the rules of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, countries tried their best to avoid another costly war. Aside from a policy of non-involvement in the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, Britain and France embarked on a policy of appeasement in the late 1930s. For example, little was done against Italy as punishment for their invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, aside from the sanctions implemented by the League, which were soon dropped due to a lack of effectiveness. The main examples of the policy of appeasement being used were with Adolf Hitler's much more powerful Nazi Germany. There were a few reasons why the policy was initially supported by the British public and those in government. One of them being that they were desperate to avoid another costly war, but also significantly that, by the 1930s, British leaders and intellectuals had agreed on the fact that all major powers had contributed to the First World War, rather than Germany alone, as stated by the Guilt Clause of the Treaty of Versailles. As a result, the British were willing to allow Germany to reverse elements of the Treaty of Versailles as they carried out their policy of appeasement. Let's take a look at a few examples of when the policy of appeasement was implemented. The first example is the rearmament of Germany. In 1933, Hitler walked out of the World Disarmament Conference and quit the League of Nations as he faced opposition from leading countries in the League and at the conference. He blamed France for the failure of disarmament, claiming that he could not leave his border defenseless when France refused to compromise and react by reducing their armaments. After Hitler's withdrawal from the World Disarmament Conference, it was clear that he aimed to rearm Germany against the Treaty of Versailles terms. Germany began to openly rearm in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which restricted German armed forces to only 100,000 men in the army, no submarines or airplanes, and only 6 battleships. The Stresa Front was an alliance between Britain, France, and Italy formed in April 1935 which aimed to ensure that there were no changes made to the Paris Peace Settlement, oppose Hitler's plans for German rearmament, reaffirm the Locarno Treaties, and maintain Austria's independence. However, the Stresa Front's weaknesses were quickly exposed, as preventing Hitler from rearming would mean that the members of the Stresa Front would have to launch a full-scale invasion of Germany, which none of them were prepared for. This pact was later completely eroded by the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, a bilateral agreement made between Britain and Germany without the consultation of Italy and France. In June 1935, just 2 short months after the Stresa Front was established, Britain and Germany signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, in which Germany was allowed to increase its navy to a maximum of 1/3 of the size of the British Navy. While this guaranteed that Britain would have a superior navy, Britain was allowing Germany to break a term of the Treaty of Versailles, which had severely limited the German navy. Britain's opposition to German rearmament had effectively been removed, and Hitler felt free to continue to increase the size of his army and navy. He ordered the construction of new battleships and began to develop a large and efficient air force. The second example is the remilitarization of the Rhineland. Hitler further defied the Treaty of Versailles when in March 1936 he took a massive risk by moving German troops into the demilitarized Rhineland area of Germany, which had been demilitarized with the aim of reducing the threat of Nazi Germany from Central Europe. Knowing that the German army was completely unprepared for war, if it had been forced to withdraw, Hitler would have faced public humiliation and would have lost the support of the German army and angered the German public. However, the gamble of remilitarization was a huge success for Hitler, who had timed the action well, as France was in the middle of a major financial crisis and was increasingly reliant on loans to avoid bankruptcy. France did not take any action as it was in the middle of a general election and would not act without Britain's support. Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary at the time, had met with the German ambassador and made his proposals. However, when Hitler refused to withdraw his troops, the British government simply did nothing, as the British people already felt that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh towards Germany, while British politicians believed that a strong Germany would be a good defense against communism. Due to the lack of effective action in response to Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland, it had exposed major weaknesses in the relationship between Britain and France, and the growing distrust between them. Hitler believed that both Britain and France would do nothing to prevent his further attempts to undermine the Treaty of Versailles, such as reuniting with Austria and annexing them, and taking over Czechoslovakia after claiming the Sudetenland. The third example is the Anschluss with Austria. On March 11th, Hitler believed that Germany had nothing to fear if they united with Austria. He wished to practice his policy of united Germany with Austria, who were German-speaking. Many people in Austria supported this idea as their country's economy was weak. They believed that unification with Germany would make them stronger. In early 1938, Hitler had encouraged Austrian Nazis to stir up trouble and stage demonstrations and riots across the country. They called for unification with Germany. In a meeting with the Austrian leader, Kurt Schuschnigg, Hitler told him that the crisis would only be resolved if he accepted the Anschluss with Germany. He reluctantly agreed. However, in a last-minute attempt, he called a referendum for the people to decide whether to unite with Germany or not. Hitler, worried that the Austrians would vote against the Anschluss, forced Schuschnigg to resign, appointing the leader of the Austrian Nazis in his place. In the elections, voters were watched over by German soldiers and 99.75% of Austrians voted for the unification with Germany. This meant that Austria's army, weapons, rich deposits of valuable ores and resources were added to Germany's growing army and industry. Hitler had been sure that Mussolini would not oppose him, as they had formed the Rhine-Berlin Axis, making them allies. Hitler knew that only Britain and France would be able to oppose him, but was confident that both nations would not take any actions against Germany due to their policies of appeasement. After they failed to take action as Germany had broken yet another term of the treaty, it had become clear that Britain and France were unlikely to react as Hitler followed his policy and reversed more elements of the Treaty of Versailles. In response to the rearmament, Britain condemned Germany, but due to the Anti-Comintern Pact, Britain was unwilling to risk war with Germany as it could lead to Japan and Italy taking action against Britain. As they were in no position to enter a major war, Britain decided not to take decisive action. Meanwhile, France was in a state of political turmoil after its whole government resigned, and they were only in a position to condemn Germany's actions. The final example of the policy of appeasement is the Sudetenland crisis and Munich Agreement. In September 1938, Hitler was demanding that the Sudetenland would be given to Germany. It had a 50% German population who claimed that they were being oppressed and mistreated by the Czechs. The Sudetenland contained 70% of Czechoslovakia's heavy industry, and it was a strong area of defense for the country, so losing this area would leave them defenseless against Germany. Hitler encouraged the Germans to stir up trouble in Czechoslovakia and demand for unification with Germany. After Hitler made an anti-Czech speech in mid-September, Chamberlain feared war, a war that could be worse than the devastating First World War. He believed that the British military was not ready to fight Germany, and the British public wished to avoid war whatever possible. The Czech leader, Edvard Beneš, became concerned that Hitler would invade his country, so he asked Britain and France to support him if it came to war. However, they were reluctant to do so, and Britain sent a politician to Czechoslovakia to recommend that certain parts be given to Germany. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain ended up meeting with Hitler, declaring that the Czech government had agreed to give him certain parts of the Sudetenland. Hitler was unhappy with this settlement and demanded the whole of the Sudetenland. As Chamberlain refused, war seemed likely, so people in Britain began constructing air raid shelters. But Mussolini helped to arrange a meeting, which became known as the Munich Agreement between British Prime Minister Chamberlain, French Prime Minister Daladier, and German Führer Hitler in September 1938, where they agreed that Hitler be given the entire Sudetenland. As Chamberlain returned to Britain, he was saluted as a hero as he was able to prevent war. German soldiers seized the Sudetenland on October 1st, 1938, with no shots fired, with the Czech leader resigning. After Hitler took the rest of the Czechoslovakia on March 15, 1939, there was no denying that the policy of appeasement had failed. In fact, it is clear that the British government already knew that in 1938, but decided to keep it up in order to buy themselves time. In fact, in 1938, the government had begun to build new warships and increase its armaments after British military leaders warned that a war was looming, and without a year or two to prepare, they would have no chance at defeating Germany. To quickly rearm and prepare for war, the lives of civilians at home were disrupted, from cutting down railings to melt down for munitions to implementing rationing and evacuation plans. Between 1938 and 1939, the government began to encourage people to prepare the home front for the dangers of war with various programs, such as planting vegetables on spare land, joining the teams of air raid wardens and the Home Guard, and learning the steps to take during air raids or gas attacks. Evacuation plans had been prepared before the war begun, with some small-scale evacuation of women and children taking place in September 1938. But it was a few hours after the war was declared on the 3rd of September where 1 million people were evacuated and relocated to rural reception areas. These evacuations proved critical as air raids proved to be the biggest danger for the home front, taking the lives of 60,595 civilians. To make it more difficult for the German bombers to target occupied areas, blackouts were implemented, but this did contribute to a rise in car accidents. Civilians were also taught how to protect themselves from potential gas attacks through the use of gas masks, which were issued to all civilians for them to carry everywhere. Men between the ages of 18 and 41 were recruited into the army and navy, meaning once again women were recruited into the factories to construct weapons and into the land army to work on farms. The upkeep of the agricultural industry was critical during the war, as much of the food, clothes, and fuel used by the British came from abroad. During the war, these supply routes were disrupted, so it was necessary for these goods to be rationed through the use of a ration book for each person in order to ensure fair distribution of all of the essentials. In the 1940s, the potential of an invasion had come into the minds of the British people after the Channel Isles fell under German control. As the Royal Air Force was suffering tremendous losses and looked to be losing the Battle of Britain, the government began recruiting volunteers to join the Home Guard to defend Britain in the event of an invasion. Like the First World War, the Second World War wreaked havoc on the world and changed much in people's daily lives. Thank you for listening to this episode of History from One Student to Another. I may be releasing more episodes for this series, but I can confirm there will be no new episodes in the month of December and at least in the first week of January, as the podcast will be on a Christmas break and New Year break. Well, not really many people want to be learning about history or listening to these podcasts over the holidays, so I think it's a good time for me to take a break and spend some time for myself. Please click subscribe to be notified when the next episode is released. You can find links to my social media and methods of contacting me in the description below. I would also greatly appreciate if you would be so kind as to buy me a coffee via the links in the description. Thanks again for tuning in to this episode. Goodbye.